Right, hello. This is quite a big subject to deal because the colonial world is a big area, and I think it's something which is people probably don't know all that much about what happened in the experience what happened immediately after the First World War at the time of the Russian Revolution and what followed. But I want to start with really how it should have gone, I suppose, in some ways. This is it. You probably know that lots of the imperial powers brought colonial troops in to fight on the Western Front during the First World War, and then sent them back to where they'd come from. Now, in the South Pacific, there's a group of islands, including Samoa, which were annexed by New Zealand in 1901. On the 11th of March 1919, the colonial authorities on Cook Island, or Rarotonga, I'm very good at these pronunciations, sent a telegram to New Zealand. Serious disturbances by returned soldiers who are taking charge of the settlement. Require armed assistance. Can you send warship or other? 50 armed men at least required. What had happened here was soldiers from there had been sent to fight on the Western Front. While they were there, they'd come across Bolshevik ideas. They'd then gone back to the South Pacific, where they'd said they weren't putting up with things anymore like they were, and started arranging an uprising. Now, unfortunately, they did send the armed troops. That was suppressed. There weren't really very many of them, and they hadn't managed to get a hold. But the reason it's worth mentioning that is because this was the other side of the world, not long after the revolution happened, to show what kind of inspiration could happen from seeing something like the Bolshevik Revolution taking place. So it showed the potential was there. And what I want to talk about really is the reality of what happened. And I think this is a story largely about, I suppose, communication and who got the message, if you like, about what was going on. Because sometimes it was actually quite difficult to communicate exactly what had been happening. But I really want to start out by thinking about the nature of the world at this point. Talking about the colonial world, this is relating to the period of, I suppose, high imperialism of what was going on. But the imperial period was relatively new at this point. If you think when the October Revolution took place in 1917, the Berlin Conference that had divided up Africa, that took place in 1884 to 85. So that was just a little over, and that was before the scramble for Africa started really, so that was a little over 30 years beforehand that then Africa had been divided up. Now there had been an imperial capitalist presence, if you like, around Africa before that, but if you think about that was when the world was divided up in that way, and the imperial powers were both quite pleased with themselves about the fact they'd divided the world up. Incidentally, the reason they met at the conference in Berlin was because they were worried about the fact that they might rub up against each other while seizing other people's land, and they didn't want to get into anything dangerous like a war between themselves, which was a real danger, and therefore they said, well, we'll decide who gets what, and then there won't be a war. Unfortunately, there was a war anyway, well, unfortunately for them at any rate. But that shows the way that they were thinking. They were proud of the fact that they were expanding and taking over the world. And indeed, they made an ideology of it. It was like to bring up Rudyard Kipling, the poet of empire, who wrote this memorable poem, The White Man's Burden, about the necessity of empire. When I'm doing a talk, I normally try and pick a different verse. It's quite long, actually. But it's worth saying how they like to picture themselves. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard, the cry of hosts ye humour are slowly toward the light. Why brought he us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? So it's a tiny little poem about how ungrateful people are that you conquered them and brought them into the modern world. And I think that this is. This was the view, certainly the self-image that people like to have, that it is the white man's burden that Britain has to. The poem is actually written, I should say, to America, saying, join us, it is our burden together that we shall civilise the world. And this was the idea: we are suffering, sending the best ye breed, as he puts it into the poem, out into the world to improve things. The reality was, of course, this was nonsense. What was happening was that the capitalist powers who'd been spreading and sucking in what was possible in order to make profits needed to control markets and also raw materials. So they went out and they conquered things. Each one wanted to have possession of more. So it was a fight between them to gain possession of the world. It was about extracting things, it was about making profits. It was certainly not about actually benefiting the people who were already there. And I should say that this shows that the imperial period that developed here was not primarily about people in the West exploiting people in poorer countries. It was about an all-out battle around the world for control of resources, which is why the world's two greatest imperial wars have centred on Europe. The First World War and the Second World War. They were world wars where lots of people all over the place got killed, but it's not just about the rich countries as such exploiting the poorer countries. Now, since then, Western countries have become a bit embarrassed about going out and conquering people, but as that poem suggests, at this point they were very proud of it. And the ruling classes, you know, here you would have had Empire Day, everyone celebrated how wonderful it was that everyone was ruled by Britain. But Britain wasn't just a monolithic country. In each of the imperial countries you had some kind of opposition movement, and in Britain you had the Labour Party. In these circumstances, what was the Labour Party saying about what was going on, this expansion and imperial growth across the world? In 1900, the Fabians, which were an ideological part of the Labour Party, in fact, the leading Fabian, George Bernard Shaw, wrote a pamphlet called Fabianism and the Empire, which said, among other things, the partition of the greater part of the globe among such powers as the great powers is a matter of fact that must be faced, approvingly or deploringly. Whether England is to be the centre and nucleus of one of those great powers of the future, or to be cast off by its colonies, ousted from its provinces and reduced to its old island status, will depend on the ability with which the empire is governed as a whole, and so on and so on. His point is that it's not empire or not empire, it's effectively becomes nicer empire run by us, or nastier empire. And in this early period, a lot of the Labour theoreticians was about this: if we were running the empire, we'd run it in a nicer way than the people who are running it at the moment. Later on, you would get to a period like the Second World War when people would be saying, well, obviously we will limit our stewardship and then we shall start removing ourselves over time, effectively when the kiddies have grown up enough to look after themselves. But for now, you need British civilization to look after people. And this was not unique to Britain. This was the same kind of message was put by all the imperial powers. So that was what was going on in the powers themselves. What about in the world? You could divide the world up of the poorer countries into two, roughly which you might call the semi-colonial world and the colonial world. The semi-colonial world would be countries such as the collapsing Ottoman Empire, which was the core of what's in the Middle East now. It had been an enormously powerful empire, but as it had been dying over the past century, the newly growing imperial powers were picking at its edges, and were thinking, I want that bit, and were fighting amongst themselves. In fact, during the First World War, they set up secret treaties. It was one of the things that the Bolsheviks did when they came to power, when they published all the secret treaties that their government had made with other governments, that they'd talked about how Russia had been hoping to get hold of Constantinople, or Istanbul, the capital. I forgot for a minute whether it actually was the capital at that point, the main city in the Ottoman Empire, as other bits were to be taken off by Britain and France and so on. So they were, after that, within this you had people resisting against what was going on. You had, in the Ottoman Empire, both a nationalist movement that would end up being the government of Turkey, and a pan-Islamic movement that was saying we need a new, something would have the Islamic world under one government. And these were the main forms of resistance. Across much of the rest of the world, you had people who were saying, the people who are successful at the moment are effectively the Western powers who have, might call bourgeois governments now, these kind of governments, and in order for us to succeed, we need to get a government like that. So you had nationalist movements in countries like, at one extreme, China, which I shall come back to later on. China had been forced into being controlled by, more or less by the West since 1839, when Britain had invaded in the Opium War. This is not one of the great wars which is taught in British schools very much and so on. This was the time when Britain had gained control of India and decided that one of the best crops they grew was opium, and they should have a free market right to sell it in China. Chinese government said, no, you can't, so Britain invaded and defeated them and got the right to sell it, and also grabbed Hong Kong, in case people were ever wondering why Hong Kong was part of the British Empire. So you saw this, that's the semi-colonized world, the people that had their own governments, but you also had the colonised world. I'm going to concentrate on Africa in terms of talking about this, which were places where they were conquered and often the local people had no say in what was going on. They were under the stewardship of, I'm going to concentrate on the British Empire because it's easier and it's a very big world to talk about. Sometimes there was an idea that people might have some role in government, but often there wasn't. And what you see again and again in terms of the movements at this time is people saying either we want a role in government, or it's quite extreme, we want dominion status, which is what countries like Canada or Australia got, where effectively they were self-governing on internal matters, or if they were really radical, we want to be an independent state. So those are the kind of movements that are going on. The most famous movement that's set up to do that was the African National Congress, which had been set up by this time, was pushing for these kinds of things in South Africa. So that's the balance of forces, roughly speaking, at the beginning of the First World War. And going through the First World War, which, as you may remember, was another one of those wars which is sometimes called a war for democracy, even though it wasn't really about democracy. And one of the things that happened outside Europe was the grabbing of large new bits of empire by the imperial powers. The communists, when they seized power in Russia, well, actually before this as well, but people didn't know so much about them before they actually came to power, took a very different view. Their view was that empire was inherently evil, they were against imperialism, and they demanded immediate freedom for people in the colonised countries. Where is it? So, for instance, Lenin said, the socialist revolution will not be solely or chiefly a struggle of the revolutionary proletarians in each country against their bourgeoisie. No, it will be a struggle of all the colonies and countries oppressed by imperialism. So it was starting to say they were demanding immediate independence for people and the chance of people to rule themselves. And this was the first thing that became a message that people heard. So when you start hearing about people being impressed by what was going on in Russia, quite a lot of them didn't know all that much about the politics of the Bolsheviks and what was going on, but they did know that they were the people who said you didn't have to submit yourself to being ruled from Europe. And this was a popular message. So you saw that as something that was a key message, and it was a key message at the end of the First World War, when you had a world in turmoil. I mean, the other meetings on what was happening in Europe, one thing that was happening as this First World War ended was the collapse of Britain's rule in Ireland, that you were moving into a period of independence war that was going on there. Elsewhere, there were things going on in the Middle East as the imperial powers tried to get hold of where they discovered the oil reserves that they now wanted were. And also people were rising up and making demands. I already mentioned the Ottoman Empire, which had collapsed as it was on the wrong side at the end of the First World War, and the victorious powers were sweeping in, trying to take control. You had, strangely for what was the dominant power in empire, a resistance movement in Turkey set up. And across, as the victorious Bolsheviks were in power, they would then have to say, how do we relate to these things? One of the first things they did on coming to power was set up an organisation called the Communist International, or the Comintern, which was about spreading revolution, so that you had international revolution spreading around the world. It wasn't just about we want communism in Russia, it was saying this has to be part of a wider thing, and this met regularly to try and get people from other bits of the world to come and discuss what we're going to do in order to get power and to have communism spread around the world. In conjunction with this, they set up another organisation, well, a congress, which was called the Congress of the Peoples of the East, that happened in Baku in 1920. I can't possibly do justice to what was an incredible and very large conference, but I will say people who are interested in that should look at this book, To See the Dawn, which I believe there's copies of at the back, which is about the Congress and actually has what people said. As you had 2,000 delegates coming from around the world to discuss what we can do. And I should say, in Russian popular, when you think about things in Russia, most of its empire was to the east. So when in casual speech, the east meant the oppressed peoples, in the same way sometimes we talk about the west and the south and so on in things. So it concretely meant the people who had been part of the Russian Empire, all the Muslim groups who had been conquered and were subject to the Russian Empire. It also meant people in China and India. It also meant people in Africa, even if though it wasn't to the east and so on. And it meant people in Mexico, for instance, for the same reason. So actually John Reed, who people may know about, who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, who had been in Mexico, spoke at the Baku Congress about the situation in Mexico. But the point I'm trying to make is that it was a thing about the oppressed peoples rather than simply about people to the east of Russia. Though that was a key area because that was where most people who were directly oppressed by the Russian Empire live. And one of the things there are a whole series of things that came up at the Congress about how you could spread communism, how relevant communism was as something that was based on workers' struggles. Was it relevant to largely peasant countries? How did the arguments that come from Marx through what were Lenin and the Bolsheviks were doing, how did they relate to what was happening in India, China or Africa? And to other issues. Sessions that happened at the Baku Congress included sessions on religious freedom. The idea of religious freedom for Muslims was particularly important at that time in an area where the Russian Empire had been Christian but had a large subject Muslim population. So the fact that the Bolsheviks were offering religious freedom to Muslims was something which was not only noticed within the Russian Empire but became quite a big issue outside it in areas like the former Ottoman Empire that was worried about being overrun by Christian powers, and in areas like India, where there were religious strifes going on. There were also issues about women's rights. There were meetings on women's rights. There was at one stage hoping to have a series of pictures from the Congress and things going on, because there's some amazing pictures of women meeting and discussing, demanding their rights and so on. One of the main things that people discussed was, how do we relate to revolutionary groups in other countries? Because outside of the Russian Empire, the former Russian Empire, most places that did have resistance groups, as I've mentioned, these groups tended to be nationalist groups or groups that were looking for building their own independent powers. How should a new communist regime relate to groups like this? And this was a central and very important issue. So for instance, if you look at the battle that was going on for Turkey, the imperial powers were coming in, the Turkish forces under Ataturk were losing badly. What should Russia do? The argument that this was the argument that came up at the Congress was they should help arm Ataturk and help the nationalist forces drive out the imperial forces. But there was a big problem with that, which is that the forces, Ataturk and people, were not actually supporting the workers' resistance. So, for instance, in, where is it? I've lost the quote from, but basically they said, look at what's going on with the Turkish forces. They always talk about freeing the people from the oppressors, but they won't say anything about agrarian reform for the poor peasants or about reform of taxation. That's pretty much what they said, though I've lost the quote somewhere in my notes. This was a particular issue, and I want to really talk about two countries. In some ways, the most important country, and just say I'm not going to talk about, really, is India. The Indian Communist Party was actually formed in exile in 1920 in Tashkent by a group of 7 people, including M.N. Roy, who went to become enormously important. There were several other communist parties appeared after this, and in 1925 they got a unified communist party, and this went on to become very important over the time. The reason I'm not talking about it is because in a way it's too big and too complicated, and it would be very interesting to do meetings on that. But I want to give 2 examples. One, if you like, is the most successful example of this kind of intervention, and the other is just briefly to say something about how difficult it was in other places. So I want to talk about China, and I want to talk about building stuff in Africa. In terms of China, you'd had the emperor was overthrown in an uprising in 1911. By 1919, the whole country was in ferment, and you had young intellectuals and so on, who tend to be anarchists, who heard about what was going on in Russia and became very excited about it. They formed what became the nucleus with people who'd been sent by the Comintern of a new communist party. Now, that party was founded in 1921, largely by intellectuals. The amazing thing is that by the time of the Hong Kong general strike, which was in 1925, they were among the leading people who recruited an awful lot of workers, people who were saying, we can lead a workers' revolution here. By 1927, they were leading a workers' revolution, and you had the uprising. And just think about that. That's in a period of 6 years since the party was founded. They're leading a workers' revolution with all sorts of problems, because they had exactly the problems that I mentioned in Turkey came up here, which was that the primary resistance initially had been nationalist resistance, the Kuomintang, who were led by Chiang Kai-shek. Actually, no, I'm not going to go through the complications of who they did at different times. The important thing is you had this nationalist organisation who were being armed by Russia for the same reason that they've been arming the Turkish nationalist resistance as a blow against imperialism. But suddenly you have a mass communist party. So how does the Communist Party, which links to Russia, relate to the Nationalist Party, which is being armed by Russia? This becomes very complicated. It leads to a massive internal argument, where if people have time, reading about Chen Duxiu, who was one of the founders of the party, and how he thought it was a very bad idea to link too closely to the Nationalist Party, is fascinating stuff. It's worth reading Harold Isaac's book on this, The Tragedy of the Chinese Revolution, if you get a chance to do it. Under the instructions of the Comintern, which was becoming increasingly Stalinized at this time, by the mid-20s, they said, you will link together. The Comintern had no longer believed that you could have what happened in Russia, which was a tipping over of nationalist revolution, so you went straight over into a socialist revolution. Comintern said, no, at this time in China you can only have a nationalist revolution, so you have to ally yourself with the Kuomintang, and you have to turn over your membership to them and say that we're not a separate organisation and so on. The Communist Party led an uprising in Shanghai, which was an incredible workers' uprising, scared the shit out of the Kuomintang, who then cracked down on them and killed all their leaders. They've got the membership lists, so they could come and take hold of them. And this row went on, amazingly, twice more. Each time the Kuomintang split, they aligned with the left faction, who then massacred them. At the end of that, to oversimplify several years of complicated politics, they went to the hills, stopped being a workers' party, and became the Chinese Communist Party we know from later on, which was largely based on the peasantry. This was a massive argument about what should be done by revolutionaries and what influence the Russian model had on other people. I think it's something that you need to study in some length. All I can really do is say that it showed enormous weaknesses in how the model that Russia was looking to was being imposed. And it was one of the times when Leon Trotsky ended up in a massive row about saying that what was going on and losing the independence of having an independent communist party with its own politics rather than just align with nationalist forces was a really important issue, was something that really had to be sorted out. And I think that this is something which is central to everything that has happened elsewhere. If you like, that was a high point because, God, in 5 years they were leading a revolution. I think it was a revolution they could have won, but that's an argument. Possibly people want to raise it in the discussion, but probably for another time. What I want to talk about, just to finish up, is about what happened in Africa, which is, if you like, a much more difficult situation because it was very hard to get connections directly to people in Africa. The African working class was not organised at the level that other working classes were. The first place where they actually managed to set up a communist party was in South Africa, where it was initially set up amongst white workers, and the first big strike wave it was in was about don't give jobs to black workers, which was a particularly disastrous thing, and showed problems that can come up with people looking to particularly sectional interests. But luckily, with time, they managed to get it where they were largely organising black workers. But you had a situation where people in Russia and around the Comintern could see how vitally important it was to organise workers across the colonial world, but they had to then meet these workers, and it was how they went about doing it that I think is fascinating. Unfortunately, I'm running out of time, but one of the things that's worth talking about is the way the Comintern tried to organise ways and to constantly sit down and think, how are we going to meet workers from largely in Europe? I mean, the Comintern's black staff largely came from America, where you had black Communist Party members. These people, not surprisingly, tended to think in a Pan-Africanist way. If you're a black person in America, and you think of yourself as African, you tend to think of Africa as a united place. That may seem obvious, but if you think of it the other way around, if you're an African who comes from Nigeria, to the extent that you think of Nigeria at that point in time, you don't necessarily think of Africa as a unit, because it's a very big place and it has all sorts of different cultures within it. So one of the things that people were trying to do was communicate with people from different backgrounds and different places and so on. Though at this point, to the extent that there was a radical idea that was taking hold in Africa, it was actually Garveyism, which was a Pan-African thing that came from America that said, rise up, ye mighty race, Africans should get together, and if we did, we would be able to take on the imperialists. And it was often through these Garveyist routes, where Garveyist newspapers and so on were sent back with sailors, that the communists first managed to get a group, a link. And the communists set up their headquarters for dealing with Africa in Hamburg, because Hamburg, which is in the news again as a port, but was at the time a place major port where sailors from around the world came, and you met African sailors who could then go back to Africa and talk about what was going on. They set up an organisation called the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers, the ITUCNW. I've never found an easy way to say that. I don't even know, if you're Christian or someone, if there's actually an easy way to say that, but I don't think there is. But they set up this organisation to try and get workers together and get people to go back to Africa, who could then bring people, often to go to Moscow for training, who could then go back to Africa and organise trade unions and build up links. The main person doing this was a guy called George Padmore, who's a fascinating person who went on to become a Pan-Africanist, to organise various Pan-African congresses and so on. But what he was trying to do was talk to often African sailors or people who were there and get them to go back. The problem that they had was that someone you met as a sailor, even if you met the best recruit you might possibly get from Africa, they weren't necessarily the most rooted or the person who could go back, often because sailors are not very rooted in the place where they come from. So this led to big rows about, can you bring someone to be trained as a leader of your, who will go back to Ghana, Gold Coast as it would have been then, and become a leader? And the answer was often, well, we've got this guy, it was almost all men at this point, will he do? And you would send someone for training in Moscow, and then they would go back and not necessarily be able to organise or be able to rise up. What they had done, if they went to Moscow, was actually get to the sort of situation where what they were thinking about was not just building up something within the empire as it stands, but demanding independence and demanding some idea of socialism. And we'd like to talk more about problems with some of the ideas that came up, but there isn't really time. I think that there was an inspiration that things could be different, and an idea that there could be equality. I mean, the highlight of the ITU-CNW's life was organising an international congress of Negro workers in Hamburg in 1930, which brought people together from some from Africa, some from the Caribbean, some from Europe and some from the US, and brought an idea of international cooperation together. And around, not necessarily at that conference, but around this feeling of people coming together, you've got people who would later be involved in nationalist struggles, such as Jomo Kenyatta from Kenya, and later on, considerably later on than this, but Nkrumah, who would go on to become the leader of Ghana. But what's interesting is that this organisation collapsed in the early 30s, and it collapsed partly, Padmore left, because he was very angry about what he saw as a problem with what the communists were doing. And I think this is something about how things change. The communists, as I said, one of the reasons why everyone liked them, everyone who was resisting things in the poorer countries liked the communists, was because they said, independence now, down with empire. In the mid-30s, with the rise of fascism, you had Russia became very afraid of being isolated and attacked by the fascists, and it moved into what was called the Popular Front phase, which said we need to have a front, an alliance with, as it turned out, the big imperial powers, Britain and France. They were trying to do, and in order to get this, they toned down some of the criticism of empire and started saying we're going to go less for demanding uprising and independence straight away. And this infuriated revolutionaries like Padmore, but also broke away from some of the radicalism that you'd seen coming out of the Russian Revolution that had spread like wildfire around the world. And I think that this is really a turning point in terms of the kind of revolutionary action that we saw. Now, unfortunately, with lots of things that come out of the Russian Revolution, they start with a blaze and wildfire going, and end as a bit of a damp squib. I don't really know what to do about that, because that's really how the history of it often worked, that you have these incredible ideas. If you read about the first 4 congresses of the Communist International and how they were going out and trying to spread revolution, and how that is slowly driven back to the idea of developing nationalist ideas and socialism in one country, that's a great pity. But it does show to me a couple of things. Firstly, the tidal wave of inspiration that went out, so that you did have uprisings in the South Pacific, and later on action in places like across Africa was very impressive, and it showed a different kind of idea. I think the thing about China shows just how quickly things can happen. Industry had been developing relatively new in terms of developing in China. If you look at Africa, people saying, well, you couldn't have organised Africa, there wasn't enough industry. If you come to just the period after the Second World War, there were more workers, there was more organisation. If you'd had the same kind of thing going on, the same kind of people who had been involved in the communist movement but later got involved in the nationalist movements, if the communist movement hadn't abandoned a lot of its radicalism for the Popular Front period, it might still have been communists, they would still have been talking about revolution in the sense that we're talking about it here. And I think that that's important, because that shows what was possible. The ideas that people had at the time were not just pipe dreams. This was something that could have worked, and it was something which could have transformed the world, so we didn't have many of the horrors we've seen in the intervening period. And that, I think, is worth remembering. Okay, thank you.
I don't want to disagree with what the speaker said. I mean, I thought it was very impressive, but I just think and I know he said there wasn't a lot of time, but the record of the international communist movement is even worse than he portrayed. Two things. During the revolution, the Bolsheviks promised independence to sections of the Russian Empire in order to break the thing up, to damage Tsarism and the white reactionary forces. Fine, but when Georgia wanted independence, Stalin put it down. I forget when exactly, but 1919 or 1918, somewhere like that. So the record of, and he was denounced by the Bolshevik leaders for great Russian chauvinism. Now that's an imperialist idea, very dangerous. Second thing is that the British Communist Party, which has the reputation of being revolutionary until, it was Stalinised, even the Communist International said in the second half of the 20s to the British Communist Party, you're not doing enough about Indian independence. You don't even support it. Change your line. Now that is actually absolute disaster. I mean, it says a terrific lot about how the ideas of the British Communist Party were imperialist and colonialist even in the 1920s. And I think we should be aware of the need for fairly tough, critical analysis of what has to be said. Now, one final point I want to make is that during the late 1930s, when Mussolini and the Italians invaded Ethiopia and Eritrea, in particular Abyssinia, there was an organisation set up in London. I think it was the African Friends of Ethiopia.
Got 1 minute.
Thank you, Conway. African Friends of Ethiopia. Not led by the communists, led by the Independent Labour Party, by the Trotskyist group within that Labour Party, CLR James in particular. The contribution of the Soviet Union to Ethiopian independence was to sell oil to Mussolini.
All right, taking off from what the last speaker said about being critical, it's sort of ironic to be listening to talk about the impact of the Russian Revolution on the colonial world by people who were founded, I mean the cliff tendency here, on the basis of hostility to defense of the social gains of the October Revolution in 1950. This is your heritage, okay? So yes, the Russian Revolution had an enormous impact on the colonial world. The Bolshevik Party was forged on the basis of uncompromising opposition to imperialism and uncompromising defense of struggles for national liberation and against the social democrats who went along with their own imperialist powers. At the same time, Lenin argued from the beginning that what you needed was a party that stood on the basis of total political independence from the bourgeoisie and all its ideologies and forces. At the Second Congress of the Communist International, Lenin submitted theses on the national and colonial question, which made the point that even in its embryonic forms, the communist parties of the colonial world had to distinguish themselves from pan-Islamism and all sorts of other bourgeois ideologies and movements. In 1978 and 79, when Khomeini was misleading and diverted a potential revolution in Iran into Islamic reaction, the response of the Socialist Workers' Party said, we support this revolution, and it's religious in form, but revolutionary in essence. No, it was religious in essence as well. All right? It was the veil. It was... Now, then we come to a few years ago with the Arab... Yes, I will. With the Arab Spring, and what does the SWP do and its cohorts in Egypt? It supports the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, if that's not bad enough, then when the Sisi and the generals move against the Muslim Brotherhood, it supports Sisi and the generals. This is what you call political independence.
Hello, comrades. For me, it's just going to be two questions, actually. All right. Can you hear me now? Okay, okay. Sorry, I never spoke on the mic before, actually. It's my first time. All right. So it's two questions for me. First, you mentioned for a brief period the early Communist Party of China after its founding years when Sun Yat-sen was still leading the Kuomintang before Chiang Kai-shek. And you said that back then they were mostly formed of intellectuals, and you mentioned the Hong Kong general strike and all that. And I'm curious a little bit more about how Mao Zedong and the later wing of the Communist Party took over after they retreated to the hills, as you said. So I'd like to know more about how that shift came to be. And second, I'm curious of what happened with the Congress for the Organization of African Workers, what it's called Negro workers, but I'm trying to avoid the term. Okay, what happened to the Congress in Hamburg after the fall of the Weimar Republic, after the Nazis gained prominence in Germany, whether it was still active by that time or basically what happened to it. Thank you, comrades, and well.
Hello, my name is Peter Alexander and I come from South Africa. I'm also an historian. And I wasn't going to speak until I heard some of the contributions being made, and I felt it was important to correct some of these misunderstandings that were being presented to us. I think the first one was about the question of Georgia, and the speaker really gave the impression that the position of the Communist Party was to support pro-Russian chauvinism. Now, what's really significant about the point here is that certainly Stalin did come up with the position, but it was countered by Lenin. And it was a key moment because it was where Lenin really broke very sharply with Stalin. And it was in the very end of Lenin's life. He'd already had a stroke, but he wanted to make it very clear to the comrades in Russia that they shouldn't be supporting Stalin on this particular question, on others as well. And it was then he came out and opposed the idea that Stalin should become his successor as the key leader of the Bolshevik Communist Party, and in fact identified with opposition to him coming from Trotsky in particular. So this is really an important thing, because I think one of the problems that certainly I face in talking about the Russian Revolution is that still many people confuse the Russian Revolution, confuse its leadership, Lenin, Trotsky and so on, with what happened subsequently under Stalin. So that argument is an important one. The other points, I didn't fully understand them, to be honest, because they deviated from the truth so much. I couldn't recognise the points that you were making. When it comes to the Iranian Revolution, Iranian workers were setting up workers' councils, pretty much like Soviets, the Shuras, and were leading a revolutionary movement which came into conflict with Khomeini and the religious leadership that then began to dominate in Iran. So to suggest that the revolutionary forces were somehow identified with that religious movement is completely fallacious. In terms of Egypt, where I visited recently, the position of the revolutionary socialists there, the people who are part of the same tendency of the Socialist Workers' Party, was certainly to defend the Muslim Brotherhoods against the military repression, which led to deaths of many of those Muslim Brotherhoods. I don't really see how you could identify with the military when there is so much bloodshed against people, we must remember, who had been democratically elected into government in Egypt. And the position of our comrades very bravely, and a number of them were arrested and sent to prison as a consequence of that, was to recognise that the Muslim Brotherhoods are certainly religious, and we certainly countered those views time and time again, but were nevertheless people who should be defended against a military dictatorship.
I'd like to extend the stuff that Ken was talking about and say a little bit more about India, because Ken quite rightly talked about M.N. Roy, who is the most significant figure in Indian communism. You know, is very much seen as the author and the founder of the Indian Communist Party in 1920. But you know, what's also very significant is that he himself was in Mexico and was part and parcel of the founding of the Communist Party inside of Mexico. And as a result of this, he was invited over to Russia by Lenin and the Bolsheviks to actually participate in these debates. And what was very significant about this is that Lenin and the Bolsheviks, in the process of the revolution unfolding inside of Russia and extending itself, not only understood very clearly about the whole question of self-determination inside of the old Tsarist empire, but that also Lenin wanted to have a firmer handle about what was going on inside of the colonial world. That's part of the reason why he wanted an individual like M.N. Roy involved in these discussions, because he wanted to understand first-hand experience, because that's what the living life, the living blood of a revolutionary movement is. It isn't just about people sitting on a high ordering diktats about how they think liberation can come about. And I think that's very, very significant, because the experience of Roy also, of course, when he goes back to India, is also very fundamental, because part of the discussions with Lenin was also about understanding that inside of the colonised world, all colonial peoples, irrespective of their class background and position, are oppressed by the colonial power and imperialism, and therefore understanding how national liberation movements can arise. But also, of course, the other significant factor is what Ken also mentioned, which of course is the need for clarity about politics, because when you have a national liberation movement, so in India, of course, you have the Indian National Congress, which became the dominant movement, and the question of the attitude that revolution should take to that was very, very important. And the history of the Communist Party inside of India is at best checkered and mixed, very much for the reasons that the very first contributor talked about. And I think the reason why it's important for us to, when we talk about the impact of the Russian Revolution on the colonised and colonial peoples in the world, is to understand how, sadly, there was the thread of the revolutionary tradition got broken in the late 20s and throughout the 1930s. And this is what led to all sorts of fundamental errors that the Communist Party in India made in terms of their attitude towards the nationalists. So initially denouncing them for being colonial lackeys, then turning around and thinking you can give uncritical support to them. And the whole point about what Ken's tried to do, and what some other speakers have tried to do, and what we're trying to do in the SWP, is to reconnect the thread back to Lenin in terms of what the lessons of October are really about in terms of fighting for genuine liberation.
Behind. Yeah.
Just like to talk about some of the positive things about the in the post-colonial world, the communist parties. I think there's been a talk of India a couple of times, and I'm from Scotland, but I'm from Indian origin, and kind of the two places in India where you had democratically elected communist governments, that was in West Bengal, Kerala, the kind of social improvements that occurred there, high rates of female literacy, and if you look at it now, you have low rates of female infanticide, low levels of kind of social problems such as gang rape, which exist in India, and in all these places in West Bengal and Kerala, you have very, very low rates of these. So the kind of social impacts that the communist parties have had in terms of land reforms and everything has been extremely positive. On another note, I'd like to commend our friend here, our gentle comrade, who actually has the courage and the guts to speak up against the increasing socialist support for an extreme fascist ideology such as pan-Islamism, and he's the first person who's actually had the guts to speak about this today, and I highly commend him. Thank you.
Man in that t-shirt in the back, you're going to speak.
I want to set the record straight about a couple of things. Okay, the Muslim Brotherhood is a reactionary outfit for Sharia law and for anti-woman, anti-Jewish oppression. It is not for the liberation of the working class. The revolutionary socialists in Egypt supported them coming to power and urged a vote for them. That is a betrayal of the working class of Egypt, and the Socialist Workers' Party did as well. Now, okay, my comrade, we're from the Spartacist League, the International Communist League, and as is well known, which is a good thing, we actually stood, unlike the SWP, who cannot lay claim to continuity with Lenin, we actually stood for the defense, unconditional defense of the Soviet workers' state up until the very end, until Yeltsin's barricades in 1991, when the Socialist Workers' Party described this this counter-revolution as something that should have all socialists rejoicing. Well, the world has been a much worse place ever since the fall of the Soviet Union and the so-called death of communism triumphalism that the bourgeoisie has proclaimed. Now, today, it is absolutely necessary for the working class to defend the gains of the Chinese Revolution of 1949, for unconditional defense of the Chinese deformed worker state that is not capitalist, and to defend North Korea as well, which is in the sights of the imperialists, of Donald Trump and the rest. I'm sorry. And it is a deformed worker state, and as with Trotsky, we stand for the working class to sweep away these bizarre Stalinist bureaucrats and return the power to the working class.
So, is none there? Yeah.
I'm sure Chinese imperialism is very grateful for the support of the Spartacist leader in the struggle today. What did you say? So yeah, the issues Ken raised are, are kind of complicated. I mean, there's a conference coming up in October about the Russian Revolution in the Black Atlantic. It looks in more detail. There's work, with other speakers' works like Hacking and Hadding's work and so on. Speaking there about it, I mean, I just think it's important to recognise what an inspiration the Russian Revolution meant across the colonial world. First of all, you can get a sense of it. There's a quote from Marcus Garvey, Jamaican Pan-Africanist, who after Lenin died, called Lenin as one of Russia's greatest men, one of the world's greatest characters, probably the greatest man in the world between 1917 and 24, when he breathed his last and took his flight from this world. We as Negroes mourn for Lenin. Russia promised great hope, not only for Negroes, but for weaker people of the world. Yeah, sense of contradiction. It's not, it's incredibly complicated. The task of Leninists in that period, communists in that period, was to try and relate to these other kind of currents. Pan-Africanism emerging, panism was emerging, not just denouncing them. Yes, Lenin said, don't paint nationalism red, don't try it, you've got to be a critical thing, but the point is, you have to give these movements kind of conditional support as well, fighting for national liberation, fighting for colonial liberation, fighting for black liberation. It's complicated. The communist parties, it's a process. The early communist parties, say Britain and France, came out of a kind of tradition, but was often kind of quite kind of, to some extent, contradictory, to some extent Eurocentric. The early British and French parties in the 20s didn't take questions of anti-imperialism as seriously as they had to in the early 20s, but they were overwhelmed with their own tasks of trying to, support the general strike in Britain in 1926. They had their own tasks, but there's criticism we can make. It's very complicated. The turn to class against class in the late 20s actually meant a greater stress on anti-imperialism to some extent within the movement. Hence, you get the formation of the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers. Padmore and so on like that, as the communist threats put more resources into fighting anti-imperialism. But again, it's the contradiction. You've got the rise of Stalinism, you've got this theory of a two-stage kind of revolution that starts to take place within the Communist International as well. First you have to achieve just national liberation, then you can talk about socialism, and that kind of stagist model starts to come through and filter through the communist parties. That's it's a contradictory legacy, but but it's a very rich history as well.
Back have they indicated before?
The first thing where the discussion's gone really is that when you talk about the issue of Islam, right, and Ken started off with the Congress of the Peoples of the East, there has to be an understanding about why people are one towards world views and over it, and what our relationship is to the oppressed. Once over, and actually the Bolsheviks had a really strong understanding, right, of attempting to side with the oppressed and to side with those who were trying to fight imperialism and stuff over it. It's an understanding as important today, because if you start to see people who turn to Islamic ideas and stuff as in some ways, the enemy, or as somebody raised in the discussion, fascists and stuff, I think you can find yourself in very strange places. at the moment, particularly when Islamophobia is one of the key issues that's used really as stuff to try to divide ordinary people. I think the second thing is about the Russian Revolution in its early stage, and the Russian Revolution, what it can mean afterwards, because the Russian Revolution was an inspiration globally because it talked about ending oppression, right, stuff over it, and that was the key message of it and stuff over it, the idea that people will be liberated, that they will be liberated and stuff from economic oppression but also colonial oppression and the rest of it. Now, if we look at the history of Russia throughout the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and China and the rest of it, actually they're not a beautiful example of liberation and oppression. Internally, they are about stamping out the right of democratic rights of workers to increase economic exploitation. Internationally, they played the same game as the US and other people about carving up the world and supporting movements to a certain extent, withdrawing support from movements to a certain extent, and the rest of it. If our model seriously to people in countries across the globe is North Korea and China, where workers can be imprisoned and attacked for going on strike, then I'm sorry, we're not going to win people to the idea of socialism. If socialism is a gulag, I don't want socialism personally and stuff around it. And actually it goes back to what Ken was saying and stuff over it. Russia was an inspiration exactly because it talked about smashing those, that kind of oppression. And that's why millions of people from all kinds of political backgrounds, even if they only had a brief understanding of what was happening in Russia, looked to it as a model. The tragedy of the situation is that by the time many people came around communist parties, we're talking about the mid to late 20s, the early 30s and the rest of it, when Stalin, the Stalinisation of those organisations were being punched through really hard. But seriously, if we're going to hold up as a model to future generations North Korea, right up over it, then maybe we should think a little bit about what socialism is supposed to look like.
I'm sorry to everyone who has to put their hands up, it's supposed to be last speaker, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a common criticism I think on campus and elsewhere about Marxism is that it's Eurocentric. I think you hear that as one of the sort of common criticisms of Marxism, particularly in places like SOAS Uni, just where we're having Marxism as well. But what I would say is that it should be clear from this meeting that obviously the Russian revolutionaries took the fight against colonialism very seriously, but I'd like to go further back to Marx as well, because I think a lot of people's criticism of Marxism comes from Edward Said's Orientalism, where he picks up on Marx's journalistic writings on India, where he sympathises with Indian people, but he does say in the 1850s that colonialism will develop a working class which will get rid of capitalism. But I think the problem with Said is he just stops as though Marx stops writing about these questions in 1850. That's not the case. In actual fact, Karl Marx was one of the first European intellectuals to support Indian independence by Indians themselves, not by anyone else. Also, Marx receives letters from Russia, which was of course a very underdeveloped country at the time. And the last 10 years of his life he spends learning Russian to answer questions, but also studying non-European countries such as Algeria and Latin America, and some of these works are not even translated into English to this day, so I think it's very important. But I think Marx was clear by the end of his life as well that not only did he support independence as a vital policy for all working class movements for oppressed countries, but also that he was explicit that the path, the things he talked about in Capital Volume 1 about how capitalism developed in Britain was not a plan where you could just say, this happened in Britain, everywhere else in the world will be the same, that have to follow the same stages as in Britain. He wrote letters on this and he said it's clear that you have to study concretely different countries and different societies, and Marx, before he died, was beginning to do that. And I think there's a long tradition of Marx and Marxism of fighting colonialism, and we need to remember that.
Right, not surprisingly, quite a few things came up there. To say, in a way, it's this is, well, as Christian said, this is something that you could hold a conference on its own quite simply. It's covering the large majority of the world's population at the time, and enormous rapid shifts in ideas. I still think that the story of what happened in China, that move to having a mass movement across 5 years, is one of the most incredible stories, and one of the most followed, I suppose, in modern Marxist thought, in as much as for what was at the time a very central revolution. It's very little looked at now compared to the 1949 revolution. I think that books such as Howard Isaac's Tragedy of the Chinese Revolution and so on are things that people should go back to. One thing that I think is particularly interesting about this whole period is the fact that lots of archives are open now, so that people have been able to look in much more detail at a lot of the things that happened. So things that we didn't know all the details of what happened are now coming out. And I just, I'm not suggesting everyone would want to read this, but a book like this, Pan-Africanism and Communism by Hakim Adi, has been through the archives about how these things went, and now has all sorts of details about actually what people were trying to do, the different communications, the missed meetings, the why haven't you sent money to Liverpool, and all sorts of things that people sent telegrams and things about. And it's actually fascinating reading if you're into this sort of stuff, because it shows the day-to-day reality of what it's like to build a revolutionary movement. It's not about standing on the sideline shouting slogans. It's about actually getting in there and talking to the working people, seeing how it is you're going to bring them towards revolutionary change. And there's, well, I won't go on about that much anymore. But to come back to some of the things that people said, I mean, I think one of the most important things is about the ideas, the mixed ideas about nationalism, about workers' solidarity, and the way that these things come together. This was a real practical problem for the Bolsheviks and for the Russian Revolution as it started, in as much as they were having to deal with nationalist forces. I've already talked about how things worked with what happened in Turkey, with the early nationalist movement in China. And these people were sometimes allies they had to work with. They were sometimes people they fought against. And often it was the same people. These situations could change. And I think that this is one of the things that you see when you actually have a revolutionary period. Is how sometimes you have to defend someone who will at another time be someone that you're fighting against. And it can be very easy to say, I have a pure politics, and it says that is my enemy, that is my friend, and I know exactly who's who, and it will stay the same for the next 70 years. Unfortunately, when you're actually on the ground, when there's a fight going on and there's people moving about and changing their ideas, these things can be very important. And the same applies not just to nationalist organisations or people that you might have to work with at certain times. I haven't gone through the details of such organisations during the period of the Russian Revolution, but there were enormous issues. There was an issue, for instance, around Baku in the Communist Party, that they had trouble recruiting Muslims for a while, because the main members of the Communist Party were Russians who said, we are the best organised people, we are the people with the most advanced ideas, we shall organise the Soviet round here, and made the Muslims feel totally excluded. That this was when there was a real push from the Communist Party in Russia to say, this is no good, this isn't how you build communism. How you build it is to actually start talking to the Muslim workers and say, we want you, it's all right for you to join the Soviet as Muslims, it's all right for you to come in and build the party. And they shifted over so that those were the people who were dominant. And this was the kind of way in which there was a shift towards what ended up winning the Civil War and gaining the dominance of communists in areas like that. This is why it was so important that one of the things that was being argued at Baku was about allowing religious ideas and people with religious ideas to come to the Congress and participate in it. At the same time as this was going on, the Bolsheviks were arguing quite strongly, and the Comintern had been arguing against, for instance, pan-Islamism. It was saying that we don't want to end up in a situation where you have people who will not criticise landlords and who will not call for agrarian reform. This was the quote that I couldn't find about the Turkish Revolution, and what was going on there was precisely that thing, that if you're fighting a battle like that, if you want to get workers and peasants to come together, the thing that matters most to them will be to do with land and taxation. And this is the thing that nationalists will not move on. And this is why this becomes an ongoing issue right through history. But it does mean that you can't simply say that people with Islamic ideas or people who support Islamic parties are therefore all inherently reactionary. And I think it's not just wrong but dangerous to say that people who support these ideas are fascist. And I think will end up siding with the imperialist forces at various times, and this has been what has practically happened. I want to come on, what was it? Over. Sorry, this is my bad handwriting and an incoherent note. I'm not going to answer that question because I can't read my response to it. So if your question isn't answered, that's probably why. The question about the early Chinese Communist Party and were they students and intellectuals, and how did Mao and people end up being in charge? Again, it's a very long and complicated story. Firstly, Mao was a member of the Communist Party from the beginning. He wasn't someone who came in from the outside later on. I think the ideas that he fought for changed over time. I think you can say lots of things about how the Chinese Communist Party developed, but one reason why it developed its independence, this is oversimplifying considerably, was Comintern says go over there and got shot. The Comintern said go over there and got shot again. The Comintern said go over there and they got shot again. Next time they said fuck off, we're going over there and we're going to stay over there with our guns in the forest and we should do things independently. Now, there's an awful lot of history and strikes and wars and people getting killed around that, but that's crudely speaking how you moved from a workers' party that was based in the working class of Shanghai to, after a long march, one that ended up in the countryside and was based on guerrilla fighting. Again, hopefully other times there'll be other meetings on this because I can't really do justice to several Chinese revolutions in a 5-minute summing up. But I would recommend, as I say, books like Harold Isaacs and various other books. There have been books more recently which have included other stuff like early things about Chen Duxiu. There's also an interesting book by Wang Fangxi that I've forgotten the title of, which is about what it was like being a Trotskyist, because the Trotskyist movement was very important in that period. The Hamburg Congress, how did it last at the end of, as Hitler came to power? It didn't. The problem is that the Hamburg Congress itself was a one-off thing, so it was a conference that people came to. Most of the delegates actually went on to Moscow, where they talked about revolution and overthrowing the colonial state. It is interesting that Hamburg was a very liberal city at the time, and that there were real problems with what happened later on, obviously after the fascists came to power. But that becomes part of another discussion. And I would recommend people come to the conference that Christian was talking about. He's the tall guy in red, in case he wasn't introduced, and I'm sure I could give you details of it at the end of the meeting. Let me see what else. Yes, I mean, I think don't get too bogged down in individual things. I think that the thing is, as people heard about the revolution, as they heard about the idea that things didn't have to be the same, the idea that things could change on a world scale, and that people who've been on the bottom could rise up, could run things for themselves. It was a massive inspiration, not just to people who became communists, but to other people. The quote, which I didn't know from Garvey, was an interesting one, so that shows that this works across the world. But it shows that what the revolution was about, what the argument was about, was freedom. It was about how do we end the things that are going wrong with the world? How do we get out of a situation where, we go through everything that's going on in the world at the moment, but where you see yourself with a drive towards war, with new imperial powers emerging and challenging and fighting each other, with a drive toward what could be nuclear war. What is the alternative to this? Is it to say, I have to back one side here or the other side, or is there another force that can actually change things? I think that one of the things that's been very sad for a lot of the past period, and certainly very sad in Britain, is that the idea of socialism, the idea that working class power might be something that can make a difference in this, is something that has been dead. I mean, I think it's one of the tragedies of what's happened over the past decades is that socialism has been seen as state-run things by enormous powers with big armies. That's what socialism is, and lots of people aren't into that, don't see that as something that's going to change things. It doesn't seem something very different. What people saw with the Bolshevik Revolution, with 1917 and the period after that, was that socialism was about turning the world upside down. It was about running everything completely differently, and it was something which said we could do things completely differently from how they are now, and here's a practical guide to how you might do it. This is what the early Comintern was doing when it was sending people out saying, you can follow this model, and this is a way that you can start changing things, and we can change the whole world so it will never go back to the way it was before. We wouldn't do it exactly the same way if that comes up again, but I think that that is something that can still be an inspiration. It's something that inspires me, and I think it's something which would inspire people to think we can change the world. The world is still savable, and it's still possible to change it and have a socialist revolution across the world. So thanks.